In the frost-bitten winter of 1871, Millbrook, Kentucky stood as a testament to resilience against nature's harshest whims. The small settlement, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, was home to barely 300 souls, most of whom made their living from the surrounding farmlands or the coal mines that scarred the landscape a few miles east. On January 17th, as snow fell in sheets of white against the darkness, Martha Blackwood gave birth to triplets in a modest cabin on the edge of town. The labor had been difficult, lasting nearly 19 hours, and by the time the third child emerged into the candlelit room, Martha was barely conscious. The midwife, Agnes Harrington, a woman who had delivered over 200 children in her 40 years of practice, found herself unnerved. She would later tell Reverend Thomas Collins that in all her years, she had never witnessed such a birth. "Not a sound," she whispered to him 3 days later, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted a cup of tea. 3 babes born into this world, and not one of them cried. They simply opened their eyes and stared, as if they'd been waiting to see what manner of world they'd entered. The Blackwood triplets, 2 girls and a boy, were identical in every visible way, each with a shock of black hair, pale blue eyes that seemed to reflect rather than absorb light, and unusually long, slender fingers. Their parents, Martha and Samuel Blackwood, named them Eliza, Emma, and Elijah. Samuel, a carpenter by trade who had moved from Virginia 5 years prior, built 3 identical cribs of polished oak. He placed them side by side in the small room adjacent to the kitchen, a room that caught the morning light through its single window. For the first 6 months of their lives, the triplets developed as any children might, though they remained unusually quiet. They rarely cried, even when hungry or uncomfortable, and the silence that hung over their cribs caused Martha to check on them constantly, fearing the worst. By their first birthday, however, it became clear that something was different about the Blackwood children. While they had begun to crawl and explore their surroundings with the expected curiosity of infants, not one of them had attempted to form any recognizable words. "Children develop at their own pace," Dr. William Mercer assured the worried parents during one of his monthly visits to Millbrook. "Especially with triplets, there can be delays. Give them time." Time, however, would only deepen the mystery. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Subscribe now to uncover the dark histories that textbooks omit and experience stories that will forever change how you see human nature. By the summer of 1873, when the triplets were 2.5 years old, Martha and Samuel Blackwood had grown accustomed to the silence of their children. They communicated with gestures, touches, and expressions that seemed to require no verbal reinforcement. What the Blackwoods had not prepared for, however, was the moment when the silence would finally break. It happened on a sweltering July afternoon. Martha was kneading dough at the kitchen table while the children played on a quilt spread across the wooden floor. Without warning, Eliza, the eldest by 7 minutes, looked directly at her siblings and uttered a string of sounds. "Shamola keti mindalu." Immediately, Emma and Elijah turned to her, their expressions animated with recognition. Emma responded with what sounded like, "Vinda shamola, keti luda." Elijah joined in, and within moments, all 3 children were engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation, complete with varied intonations, gestures, and emotional expressions. Martha Blackwood stood frozen, the flour dust suspended in the air around her hands. For nearly 10 minutes she watched as her children conversed in sounds that resembled no language she had ever heard. It wasn't baby talk or the mimicry of adult speech. It had structure, rhythm, and most disturbing of all, it seemed to follow rules that the triplets instinctively understood. When Samuel returned from his workshop that evening, Martha recounted what she had witnessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "They spoke as if they'd been talking for years," she told him. "Not like children learning, but like people who already know their words." Over the next few weeks, The Blackwood triplets continued to converse in their unique language. They spoke only to each other, and only when they believed they were alone. When addressed in English by their parents, they would respond with gestures or expressions, but never with words from their private language. Dr. Mercer, summoned back to the Blackwood home, observed the children for an entire day. He concluded that while unusual, their behavior wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. There are documented cases of twins developing private languages, he explained, referencing medical journals from Philadelphia. Though I admit, the complexity of their speech is remarkable for their age, and I've never seen such a case with triplets. Word of the Blackwood children's strange language soon spread through Millbrook. Some neighbors suggested it was merely an extreme case of the cryptophagia, sometimes observed in twins, a private language developed in isolation. Others, particularly those inclined toward superstition, whispered darker theories about changelings or spirits. Reverend Collins, upon hearing these rumors, visited the Blackwood home to observe for himself. A man of education as well as faith, having studied at a seminary in Boston, he brought with him a notebook in which he attempted to transcribe the sounds he heard the children make. After several visits, he had compiled nearly 30 distinct words, along with crude phonetic spellings, though he could discern no pattern or meaning. "It isn't gibberish," he confided to his wife later. "There's a consistency to it, a structure. They use the same sounds to refer to the same things. But it's like nothing I've ever heard. Not English, not German, not French, nor any Indian language I've encountered in my readings." By their third birthday in January 1874, the triplets had developed a vocabulary that Reverend Collins estimated to contain over 100 distinct words or phrases. Their ability to communicate with each other was fluid and natural, but their refusal or inability to speak English remained absolute. Samuel and Martha had begun to adapt, learning to interpret certain sounds and developing a rudimentary sign language to bridge the gap between them and their children. But the question that haunted them remained unanswered. Where had this language come from, and why couldn't their children speak or understand English? As winter thawed into spring, the mystery of the Blackwood triplets would attract attention far beyond the boundaries of Millbrook, Kentucky. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday in April 1874. It was addressed to Samuel Blackwood and bore the seal of Hartford University in Connecticut. Inside, on heavy cream stationery, Professor James Worthington, chair of the Department of Linguistics, expressed his profound academic interest in the case of the Blackwood triplets. News of their unusual language had reached him through a colleague who had corresponded with Reverend Collins. "I believe your children may represent a unique opportunity to study the very foundations of human language acquisition," the professor wrote. "With your permission, I would like to visit Millbrook to observe them directly. All expenses would be covered by the university's research fund." Samuel and Martha discussed the letter late into the night. They were simple people with simple lives, suspicious of outsiders and protective of their privacy. But they were also desperate for answers, for some understanding of why their children remained locked in a linguistic world of their own making. "Perhaps this professor can help them learn proper English," Martha said hopefully. "Maybe he'll understand where these strange words come from." 2 weeks later, Professor Worthington arrived in Millbrook. He was a tall, slender man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and wire-rimmed spectacles. Despite his formal attire and scholarly demeanor, he displayed a gentle manner with the children, observing them at play without interruption for the first 2 days of his visit. On the third day, he set up what he called a controlled observation. He brought out a series of simple objects, a ball, a wooden block, a spoon, a cup, and placed them before the triplets one by one. As the children handled each item, discussing it in their language, Worthington made detailed notes and used an early recording device, a recent innovation he'd brought with him, to capture their sounds. "Remarkable," he muttered repeatedly. Absolutely remarkable. By the end of his week-long visit, Worthington had filled 3 notebooks with observations and phonetic transcriptions. He had also made several wax cylinder recordings of the triplets' speech. Before departing, he sat with Samuel and Martha at their kitchen table and shared his preliminary findings. Your children have developed what we call an idiolect, a completely unique language system, he explained. But unlike most twin languages or private languages, theirs shows sophisticated grammatical structures that children their age shouldn't be capable of creating. There appear to be consistent rules for verb conjugation, noun classification, and even what linguists would call morphological markers. Seeing the blank expressions on the Blackwoods' faces, Worthington simplified. In plain terms, they aren't just making random sounds. They've created a complete language with rules as complex as English or Latin, possibly more so in some aspects, and they've done it spontaneously, without any apparent external influence. But why won't they speak English? Martha asked, the question that had troubled her for years finally voiced directly. Worthington removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That's the greater mystery, Mrs. Blackwood. They clearly understand English. They respond appropriately to your instructions and questions, but they choose not to use it among themselves or with you. It's as if this language of theirs takes precedence, as if it's more natural to them. Before leaving, Worthington made the Blackwoods an offer. Hartford University would provide financial assistance if they would allow him to continue his research. This would include periodic visits and, potentially, bringing the triplets to Connecticut for more extensive study when they were older. Think about it, he said. This isn't just about academic curiosity. Understanding their language might be the key to helping them integrate into the wider world. As the professor's carriage pulled away from their cabin, Samuel put his arm around Martha's shoulders. What do you think? He asked quietly. I think, Martha replied, watching the dust settle on the road, that our children are trying to tell us something. And maybe this man can help us understand what it is. I watched the video this far and feel compelled to say this. Some voices speak from places beyond our understanding, carrying messages we may never fully translate. What unknown language would you create if you could speak directly to the soul? Summer faded into autumn, and with the changing leaves came Professor Worthington's second visit to Millbrook. This time he brought with him a young assistant, Clara Bennett, one of the few women admitted to Hartford's graduate program. While Worthington focused on documenting the structural elements of the triplets' language, Clara's task was to observe and record the context in which certain words or phrases were used. Language doesn't exist in isolation, she explained to Martha, as they watched the children play in the yard. It's shaped by environment, by needs, by the things we wish to express. If we can map their words to the circumstances in which they use them, we might begin to build a rudimentary dictionary. By this time, the triplets were nearly 4 years old. They had grown into solemn, watchful children with an uncanny synchronicity in their movements. They would often arrange themselves in a triangle when playing or conversing, equally spaced as if by measurement rather than instinct. Their black hair had grown long and straight, and their pale blue eyes seemed to have lightened further, taking on an almost translucent quality in certain lights. Clara gave each child a small notebook bound in different colored leather, red for Eliza, blue for Emma, green for Elijah. Inside each book, she had pasted images cut from magazines and illustrated books. Animals, household objects, landscapes, people engaged in various activities. Her hope was that the children might point to these images while using their language, providing context for their mysterious words. The experiment yielded unexpected results. Rather than simply pointing and speaking, the triplets began to draw in the notebooks, creating intricate symbols beside or around the printed images. These symbols appeared to be a form of writing, with consistent shapes that corresponded to specific sounds in their spoken language. "They've developed a writing system," Worthington breathed, examining the notebooks with Clara one evening after the children had gone to bed. "Independently and spontaneously. Do you understand the implications of this, Bennett? Children of 4, creating not just a spoken language, but a written one as well?" "It suggests the language existed before they did," Clara replied quietly, "as if they're remembering it rather than inventing it." The idea hung in the air between them, neither willing to fully acknowledge what it might mean. Over the next 2 days, Worthington and Clara devoted themselves to collecting and categorizing the symbols from the children's notebooks. They identified approximately 60 unique characters, some appearing more frequently than others. Certain combinations seemed to represent common concepts or objects. There was a distinct sequence that appeared whenever the triplets referred to water, another for sky, another still for the concept of time or waiting. On the final evening of their visit, as Samuel and Martha prepared a farewell dinner, Worthington made a discovery that visibly shook him. He had been comparing the triplet symbols to writing systems from around the world, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese characters, Sanskrit, hoping to find similarities that might indicate cultural influence, however unlikely. Instead, he found a partial match in an obscure academic journal he had brought with him. "These 7 symbols," he said, showing Clara a page in one of the children's notebooks, "bear a striking resemblance to characters found on a stone tablet excavated near Thebes in 1867. The tablet has never been translated and is believed to predate dynastic Egyptian civilization." "That's not possible," Clara whispered, looking over his shoulder at the comparison. "There's no way these children could have seen that journal or known about that tablet." "No," Worthington agreed, "there isn't." When they departed the next morning, Worthington left the colored notebooks with the children but took with him detailed copies of every symbol and drawing they had produced. He promised to return in the spring with more insights and perhaps some answers. Martha noted that he seemed both excited and troubled, his earlier academic enthusiasm now tempered with something that looked almost like concern. As the months passed, the triplets continued to fill their notebooks with symbols and drawings. They created what appeared to be maps of places they had never seen, detailed anatomical sketches of animals they had never encountered, and star charts that Martha could not reconcile with the night sky visible from Kentucky. When she asked them about these drawings, they would only respond in their language, sometimes tracing the symbols with their long, slender fingers, as if expecting her to understand through touch what she could not comprehend through sound. By the time winter had wrapped Millbrook in its cold embrace again, Samuel had built a small separate room onto their cabin where the triplets could be alone with their notebooks and their private conversations. Both parents had come to accept that there was something extraordinary about their children, something beyond the usual bounds of childhood development or even the rare phenomenon of cryptophagia. "They're trying to tell us something," Martha would say, echoing her words from months earlier. "Something important. I just don't know if we'll ever understand what it is." Professor Worthington did not return in the spring as promised. Instead, a letter arrived in late April, explaining that he had fallen ill with pneumonia and was confined to his bed in Hartford. In his place, he had sent Clara Bennett to continue their research. She arrived with trunks full of books, notebooks, and scientific instruments, prepared for an extended stay at the local boarding house. Clara's approach differed from the professor's. Where Worthington had focused on the structural linguistics and historical connections, Clara was more interested in the triplets themselves, their behaviors, their interactions, their apparent understanding of concepts they should have no knowledge of. "They drew this yesterday," she said to Samuel one afternoon, showing him a page from Emma's blue notebook. On it was a detailed diagram of what appeared to be the inner workings of a clock, with gears and springs precisely rendered. "Have they ever seen the inside of a timepiece?" Samuel shook his head. "I own a pocket watch, but it's never been opened in their presence." Similar incidents accumulated during Clara's stay. The triplets, now 4.5 years old, demonstrated knowledge of subjects far beyond their years and experiences. They drew anatomically correct depictions of animals found only in Africa or South America. They created mathematical equations that Clara, with her university education, struggled to understand. And most disturbing of all, they sometimes spoke in unison, their private language flowing from three mouths as if from one mind. In June 1875, Clara began a new experiment. With the Blackwoods' permission, she separated the triplets for the first time in their lives. Samuel had built 3 small, identical cubicles in his workshop, each with a table and chair. For 1 hour each morning, Eliza, Emma, and Elijah would be placed in separate cubicles with their notebooks and pencils, unable to see or hear each other. "I want to see if their language persists in isolation," Clara explained, "and whether they continue to produce the same drawings and symbols independently." The results were astonishing. On the first day, each child filled precisely 3 pages of their notebook. When Clara compared them afterward, she found that they had produced nearly identical content, the same symbols, the same drawings, arranged in the same pattern on each page. It was as if they had coordinated their work despite having no means of communication. This pattern continued for 7 consecutive days. Each morning, the triplets would produce identical or nearly identical content in their separate cubicles. Clara meticulously documented everything, sending weekly reports to Professor Worthington in Hartford. His replies grew increasingly urgent, filled with questions and theories that bordered on the fantastic. On the morning of the 8th day, something changed. When placed in their cubicles, the triplets did not reach for their notebooks as usual. Instead, they sat perfectly still, hands folded on the tables before them. After exactly 17 minutes by Clara's pocket watch, all 3 began to speak simultaneously, not in their private language, but in perfect, unaccented English. "We understand your confusion," they said, their voices blending in eerie harmony. "We have tried to communicate through the language that comes most naturally to us, but we recognize now that complete understanding may not be possible." Clara, who had been observing through small viewing slots in the cubicle walls, was too stunned to speak. The triplets continued, still in unsettling synchrony. "We are not what you think we are. The vessel is human, but what animates it is not. We do not possess the language to explain our nature or purpose in terms you would comprehend. The symbols we have provided are the closest approximation of certain truths that exist beyond your current scientific understanding." When Clara finally found her voice, she asked the question that had haunted everyone since the triplets' birth. What are you? The children tilted their heads at the same angle, as if considering how to respond. "We are observers," they said finally, "recorders of a kind. We exist in many places, in many forms. This manifestation, these 3 bodies, is but one expression of a larger consciousness." "Why can't you just speak English like you're doing now?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The language you call English is inadequate for our internal communication. The language we use among ourselves contains concepts and connections for which your languages have no equivalent. Speaking as we are now requires considerable effort and translation, which is why we have avoided it." Clara hurriedly documented everything, her pencil flying across the pages of her notebook. The implications were overwhelming. Either the triplets were suffering from an unprecedented form of shared delusion, or they were something entirely outside the realm of conventional science. "Will you speak like this to your parents?" she asked finally. "We will try," the triplets replied, "but not in this manner. It is too disturbing for those who love these forms as children. We will learn to separate, to speak individually as humans do. It will take time." True to their word, when Samuel and Martha came to the workshop at noon, the triplets spoke to them in English for the first time, not in unison, but as individual children with distinct voices. Martha wept openly, gathering them in her arms. Samuel stood back, his expression a complex mixture of joy and unease. None of them mentioned what had been said in the cubicles. Clara wrote to Professor Worthington that same evening, but decided to omit certain details from her report. Some truths, she reasoned, were too disturbing to commit to paper, at least until she better understood what they were dealing with. That night, as the household slept, Clara quietly entered the triplets' room. They were awake, arranged in their usual triangle on the floor, notebooks open before them. When they saw her, they did not speak, but Emma, the middle triplet, held out her blue notebook. On the open page was a single line of their symbolic writing, followed by its English translation. Not all questions are meant to be answered in the language of those who ask them. By the autumn of 1875, life in the Blackwood household had transformed. The triplets, now approaching their 5th birthday, spoke English fluently, their vocabulary and syntax far beyond what would be expected of children their age. To casual observers, they might have seemed like unusually bright and well-spoken children. Only those who had known them before, who had witnessed their years of silence and private communication, understood the profound strangeness of their development. Professor Worthington, recovered from his illness, returned to Millbrook in October. He was noticeably thinner, his once neat beard now unkempt, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Martha uncomfortable. He had read Clara's reports, both the official ones and the private letters she had sent detailing the disturbing session in the cubicles. He came not just as a linguist now, but as a man pursuing something that had moved beyond academic interest into obsession. "I need to understand the full extent of their knowledge," he insisted during a tense conversation with the Blackwoods and Clara. The symbols in their notebooks correspond to mathematical and astronomical concepts that weren't discovered until the last century. Their original language contains grammatical structures that would require thousands of years of linguistic evolution to develop naturally. Whatever these children are, they represent the most significant scientific discovery of our age. Samuel Blackwood, who had remained largely silent throughout the months of study and speculation, finally spoke up. "They are not a scientific discovery, Professor. They are our children. And I'm beginning to think that all this attention, all this probing, isn't good for them." Worthington's expression hardened. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, I don't think you grasp the implications here. If what Clara witnessed is true, if your children are indeed vessels for some kind of external consciousness, then the potential knowledge they possess could transform our understanding of human existence." "And if they're just unusual children?" Martha interjected. "Children who deserve to live without being treated like specimens?" The conversation ended in an uncomfortable impasse. Worthington was granted permission to continue his observations for 2 more weeks, but under stricter conditions. The triplets would not be separated again, and all interactions would be supervised by at least one parent. During those 2 weeks, Eliza, Emma, and Elijah demonstrated abilities that went beyond their linguistic talents. They could perform complex mental calculations instantly. They could reproduce passages from books after a single reading. Most remarkably, they appeared to know things they had never been taught: historical events, scientific principles, geographical details about places thousands of miles from Kentucky. When asked directly about their abilities or their true nature, they would either deflect the question or respond with cryptic statements that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Only once, when Worthington pressed too hard, did they revert to their unsettling unified speech. "We have told you what we can," they said in perfect synchrony, their voices creating harmonics that seemed to vibrate in the air. "The limitations are not in our knowledge, but in the capacity of human language and human minds to comprehend certain truths. Some questions have answers that would break rather than enlighten. The incident left Worthington shaken, but even more determined. On his final day in Millbrook, he made the Blackwoods an offer. Hartford University would provide a substantial annual stipend if the triplets were allowed to relocate to Connecticut for comprehensive study. They would live in comfortable quarters on campus, with Martha accompanying them if she wished. The best educators would be provided, along with access to the university's extensive libraries and resources. They could develop their extraordinary gifts in an environment that truly appreciates them, Worthington argued, and the knowledge they might share could advance human understanding by decades, perhaps centuries. Samuel and Martha asked for time to consider the offer. After Worthington departed, promising to return in the spring for their answer, they spent long evenings discussing their children's future. The financial security was tempting. Samuel's carpentry business had suffered, as his attention was increasingly diverted to the triplets and the various researchers who came to observe them. And perhaps in an academic environment, their children would find peers who could challenge their unusual minds. But there were darker considerations as well. Worthington's interest had shifted from scholarly curiosity to something more fervent, almost evangelical. What would happen if the triplets were placed under his direct supervision? Would they be children, or would they become full-time subjects, their every word and action scrutinized for scientific value? 2 days before Christmas, as snow fell outside their cabin, Samuel and Martha finally asked the triplets themselves what they wanted. "We know you understand more than most children your age," Martha said, gathering them close on the sofa before the fireplace. "Professor Worthington wants you to go with him to Connecticut, to his university. Father and I need to decide what's best for you, but we'd like to know your thoughts." The triplets exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them despite their newfound ability to speak English. It was Elijah, the youngest by 12 minutes, who answered. "We've served our purpose here," he said, his voice soft but clear. "We've learned what we needed to learn about this family, this community, this way of living." "What do you mean, served your purpose?" Samuel asked, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settling over him. "We came to observe and record," Emma explained, "to experience human development from its beginning stages, to understand how humans learn language, form connections, build understanding of their world." Eliza continued where her sister left off. "The professor would study us, but we have been studying you. All of you. Your kindness, your confusion, your limited perception, your boundless capacity for love despite understanding so little of the universe around you." Martha drew a sharp breath. "And have you finished your study?" The triplets smiled, the same smile on 3 different faces at exactly the same moment. "Not entirely," Elijah said. "But we've learned enough in this form. It's time for a choice." "What choice?" Samuel asked, his voice barely audible. "We can go with the professor and continue our observations in a new environment. Or we can move on." "Move on?" Martha repeated. "Move on where?" "To another form, another time, another aspect of human experience." Samuel and Martha sat in stunned silence. For years they had known their children were different, special in ways they couldn't articulate. But this conversation confirmed what they had feared in the deepest corners of their minds, but never dared acknowledge. The souls that inhabited their children's bodies were not entirely theirs. "Would you leave us?" Martha finally asked, tears welling in her eyes. The triplets looked at each other again, and for a brief moment, they seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the boundaries of their physical forms had become momentarily indistinct. "These vessels would remain," Emma said gently, "but what you recognize as us, our consciousness, our knowledge, would depart." The children would remain as normal 5-year-olds with no memory of their first years, no unusual abilities, no knowledge beyond what typical children their age possess. You'd be starting fresh with 3 ordinary children, Eliza added. The children you perhaps always wanted. Samuel stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow. Martha remained on the sofa, her arms still around the triplets, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "And if we choose the professor?" Samuel asked without turning. "We would maintain our current state," Elijah explained. "We would continue to possess the knowledge and abilities you've witnessed. We would cooperate with his studies to a point. But eventually, when we've gathered all we can from that experience, we would move on anyway. It is the nature of our existence." That night, after the triplets had gone to bed, Samuel and Martha talked until dawn. They talked about love and parenthood, about the strange journey they had been on since that snowy January night 5 years earlier. They talked about what it meant to love children who were not entirely what they appeared to be, and about what it would mean to start again with normal children who would have no memory of their extraordinary beginnings. When morning came, they had made their decision. On January 17, 1876, the Blackwood triplets celebrated their 5th birthday. It was a small affair, attended only by family and a few close friends, including Clara Bennett, who had chosen to remain in Millbrook rather than return to Hartford. The triplets were cheerful but subdued, as if they already knew what was coming. That evening, after the guests had departed and the cabin was quiet, Samuel and Martha sat with their children before the fireplace, just as they had on that December night when the truth had finally been spoken aloud. "We've decided," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "We want you to be free to continue your journey. But we also want what any parents want, children who can grow and learn and live normal lives." "We understand," the triplets said in unison, before catching themselves and continuing as individuals. "We've prepared for this," Eliza said. "We've left everything you'll need in our notebooks," Emma continued, "including a letter for Professor Worthington, explaining why we won't be joining him in Connecticut," Elijah finished. Martha gathered them in her arms one last time, holding them close. "Will it hurt?" she whispered. "No," they assured her. "Neither for us nor for them, the children who will remain." "Will you remember us?" Samuel asked, finally giving voice to the question that had haunted him. "Wherever it is you go next, will you remember this family this time?" The triplets smiled their identical smile. "Memory for us is not as it is for you," Eliza explained, "but the knowledge we've gained, the understanding of human love and connection that becomes part of what we are. In that way, yes, we will remember." As the fire burned low, the triplets arranged themselves in their familiar triangle on the rug before the hearth. They joined hands and began to speak in their original language, the complex, melodic language that no human scholar had been able to translate. The sound filled the cabin, resonating in the wooden walls and beams, vibrating in the glass of the windows and the metal of the cookware. Samuel and Martha watched, tears streaming down their faces, as a soft blue light began to emanate from the joined hands of their children. The light grew, enveloping the 3 small bodies in a luminous cocoon. For a brief moment, so brief they would later wonder if they had imagined it, they thought they saw something else within that light, something vast and complex and utterly beyond their comprehension. And then the light was gone. The triplets lay on the rug, still arranged in their triangle, but now deeply asleep, their breathing soft and regular. When they awoke the next morning, they were, as promised, ordinary 5-year-old children. They spoke English as any children their age might, with simple vocabulary and grammatical mistakes. They remembered nothing of their previous abilities, nothing of the strange language they had spoken, nothing of the knowledge that had so amazed and disturbed Professor Worthington. The colored notebooks were found neatly stacked on the table in the Triplets room. Most of the pages were now blank, as if the symbols and drawings had never existed. Only 3 pages remained filled: a detailed letter to Professor Worthington, explaining that the subjects had chosen to terminate the study, a page of instructions for Samuel and Martha on helping the children adjust to their new state, and a final page containing a single sentence in perfect English. The greatest discovery we made was not about the nature of language, but about the nature of love, how it persists even in the face of the incomprehensible. When Professor Worthington returned to Millbrook in the spring of 1876, he found 3 normal children and the letter explaining what had happened. Despite his protests and attempts to reverse whatever had occurred, he eventually accepted the reality. The extraordinary triplets he had studied were gone, replaced by ordinary children who would grow up with no memory of ever having been anything else. Clara Bennett remained in Millbrook, eventually marrying a local teacher and maintaining a lifelong friendship with the Blackwood family. She never published her findings or spoke publicly about what she had witnessed. Some experiences, she decided, were too profound to be dissected in academic journals or debated at scientific conferences. As for the Blackwood triplets, they grew up as normal, healthy children. They remained unusually close, as many multiples do, but displayed no extraordinary abilities or knowledge. Occasionally, in unguarded moments, Martha would catch them arranging themselves in a triangle while playing, or humming a melody that sounded vaguely familiar, but these incidents grew rarer as the years passed. By the turn of the century, the story of the triplets who spoke a language no one could translate had faded into local legend, a curious tale told by the older residents of Millbrook but dismissed by newcomers as rural fantasy. Only the Blackwoods and a few others knew the truth, and they kept it close, understanding that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some experiences beyond the realm of scientific explanation. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality.